In August 30 BCE, a fatal snakebite brought 3,000 years of pharaonic rule to an abrupt halt. With the suicide of Cleopatra VII, the long-reigning Ptolemaic dynasty collapsed, leaving an unimaginably wealthy kingdom without a ruler. Octavian arrived in Alexandria as a conqueror, ready to absorb the oldest and most culturally complex civilization on Earth into the rising Roman Empire. Recognizing the danger this newfound wealth posed, Octavian made a highly unusual constitutional decree. He decided Egypt would not be governed like a normal Roman province. Instead, it became his exclusive personal property, his patrimonium. He even passed a law for any Roman senator from visiting the province without his explicit written permission. He implemented this strict ban for a simple reason. Egypt was so economically vital and so strategically critical as a grain supplier that whoever personally controlled the Nile held the power to leverage the entire Roman Empire. Egypt's immense value rested entirely on a biological engine, the Nile River. Every summer, monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands force the river to overflow its banks, depositing a thick layer of rich silt across the floodplain. To predict the harvest, the Romans relied on nilometers. By measuring the water's height against marked stone pillars, administrators calculated the exact food yield. They weaponized these measurements to set mandatory grain taxes, ensuring every ounce of surplus wheat was extracted from local farmers. This chart shows the scale of that extraction. At its peak, Egypt was forced to supply approximately 300,000 metric tons of grain annually, enough to cover roughly 1/3 of the total food required to sustain the urban population of Rome. Moving that much cargo required a massive maritime operation. Grain was loaded onto cargo ships in the port of Alexandria, which then sailed across the Mediterranean to reach Rome's purpose-built harbors. But while these ships delivered extreme wealth to Italy, the native Egyptian peasant class, the loaves, endured a different reality. To ensure maximum extraction, the Romans subjected them to strict censuses every 14 years and forced them to pay severe poll taxes. The celebrated Roman peace and the golden age of the empire were subsidized by the systematic, centuries-long impoverishment of the Egyptian people. Into this exploited environment, a new faith arrived from the Levant in the 1st century CE. The native population, already familiar with narratives of divine suffering and physical resurrection, provided a receptive audience for early Christianity. As it spread, the religion evolved across two distinct landscapes. In the streets of Alexandria, it became highly intellectual, producing formal theological schools. But out in the harsh Egyptian desert, it took a very different shape. Figures like Saint Anthony and Pachomius pioneered Christian monasticism. They led retreats deep into the arid wastelands, creating isolated communities to physically escape Roman tax collectors and worldly corruption. To spread their gospel among the peasantry, they adapted the Greek alphabet to write down the spoken Egyptian language. This new script, known as Coptic, allowed them to translate the Bible for ordinary people who couldn't read Greek or Latin. By translating the faith into the local tongue and removing themselves to the desert, native Egyptians built a cultural identity that existed outside the reach of the Roman administrative machine. The Roman state responded to this movement with extreme violence. Starting in 284 CE, Emperor Diocletian launched a campaign of persecution, demolishing churches and executing thousands in what became known as the Era of Martyrs. But rather than breaking the community, the violence solidified it. The shared trauma of these purges forged a resilient Coptic Christian identity that survived the Roman sword. Then, the empire made an astonishing reversal. In 313 CE, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, officially legalizing the faith. Within a few generations, this persecuted religion became the official, mandated faith of the very state that had tried to stamp it out. The spiritual revolution was complete. The faith of the Nile's heavily taxed peasantry had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. For hundreds of years, early Roman emperors had pragmatically depicted themselves on temple walls as traditional pharaohs. But as the empire centralized around its new Christian identity, tolerance vanished, and a campaign to erase the old gods began. Imperial edicts outlawed pagan worship. In 391 CE, a Christian mob destroyed the Serapeum Temple in Alexandria. A few decades later, the brilliant mathematician and philosopher Hypatia was murdered by zealots in the city streets. The ancient culture died quietly at the isolated island temple of Philae. There, in August of 394 CE, a lone priest carved an invocation into a stone wall, the very last dated hieroglyphic inscription in human history. With those final strokes, a continuous religious and literary tradition that had built the pyramids and survived for nearly 3.5 millennia was permanently extinguished as a living institution. In 395 CE, the Roman Empire split. Egypt fell under the jurisdiction of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, governed from Constantinople. This new administration immediately stumbled into a fatal conflict. Following the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE, a theological dispute over the nature of Christ resulted in the Byzantine state declaring the native Coptic Egyptian church heretical. The imperial government began violently enforcing its own religious orthodoxy. The Byzantines were now actively persecuting the very Egyptian citizens responsible for growing their food. This chart shows the vulnerability that created. When the Arab Muslim general Amr ibn al-As crossed the Sinai Peninsula in 639 CE, he brought a remarkably small force of only 4 soldiers to face a massive imperial territory. His conquest faced almost no resistance. The native Egyptians were so alienated from their oppressive Byzantine rulers that they stood by as the garrisons fell, allowing Roman rule in Egypt to permanently collapse by 641 CE. The people of the Nile left a cultural blueprint that remained in use long after the Roman world collapsed.